Welcome to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast, where our host and expert guests delve into and scrutinise the pressing issues and emerging trends in climate business and climate finance. We greatly appreciate your support. Please like, review and subscribe to the podcast to help us grow and reach a wider audience. Be sure to take note of the disclaimers at the conclusion of each show. And now, here is your host, investor, analyst and author, Joseph Giacobelli.
Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, wherever you may be listening from. Welcome to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast, and you're listening to episode 75. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most critical challenges facing our region, translating climate ambition into action. Asia is home to half the world's population and accounts for over half of global emissions. It's also where the largest pipeline of energy transition projects are unfolding. Yet, despite remarkable progress in recent years, the path from policy commitment to real-world implementation remains uneven and remains complex. In this episode, I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking to Ha Do, a leading climate finance expert with deep experience working across Asia's public and private sectors. We'll explore how governments from Singapore to Vietnam are embedding sustainability into their planning and procurement frameworks. We'll examine the climate finance mechanisms, from green bonds to blended finance models, that are actually mobilizing capital for adaptation and mitigation projects. And we'll investigate a question that matters enormously: how mature is ESG integration among Asian corporates and state-owned enterprises, and what barriers are holding back climate-aligned investment. But this conversation really goes far beyond diagnostics. We'll also look at emerging trends in green infrastructure, discussing how Asian jurisdictions are navigating the fragmented regulatory landscape around climate risk disclosure, and ask a more forward-looking question: is Asia destined to remain a follower of global standards, or is the region beginning to shape the architecture of global climate finance itself? If you find this podcast valuable, please do subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or whichever platform you prefer. Your subscription really helps us reach more people working on climate solutions around Asia and globally. Now let's dive in. Hello, Ha. Thank you so much for making it to the Asia Climate Finance Podcast.
My pleasure to be here, Joseph. Thank you for including me. Thanks a lot.
No, it's really great, especially given your background, your expertise. It's going to be a really interesting conversation. Are you in Hanoi right now?
Yeah, I'm in Hanoi, and you know what? We are welcoming the autumn now. The sky is blue, light breeze, so it's absolutely fantastic time to be in Hanoi right now, Joseph.
Wow! I wish I could join you. I wish I could join you. Maybe next time I'll fly in during the autumn. So again, thank you so much for making it, and we're gonna get right into it because it's a very broad conversation. I guess first of all, it's really about your experience in talking to various corporations, various governments about what is going on in the energy transition. So I was going to ask, how are governments across the Asia-Pacific region actually integrating climate risk and sustainability into public sector planning and procurement frameworks? And are we seeing a shift from policy ambition to implementation? Perhaps we could just focus on a few countries. So I guess another way of saying it is, if we look at what happened, not in the last quarter or last 1 year, but in the last 5 years, what has that evolution been like?
Thank you, Joseph. A very interesting question. And may I start my answer by very short answer first is...
Sure.
We definitely see a yes. In terms of the government across Asia are actually moving from ambitious policies toward more concrete implementation. However, such progress is not, may I say, even across the region. We see, for example, a growing set of legal rules, sectoral targets, procurement mandates, and reporting tools launched in places like Singapore, Korea, Japan, and China. While for some emerging markets, especially in ASEAN, then we see such a kind of progress is still very slow because those countries still face the challenges in terms of capacity, cost, and supply market barriers. I will just move into more details to share with you our observation on how the governments are actually integrating climate risk and sustainability and move again from policy to more implementation. So the first one is we see that governments start to embed sustainability targets in national plans and public sector commitments. We see that many governments now actually attach the explicit emissions, resource use, or resilience targets to public agencies. For example, building energy targets, waste reductions, etc. So this makes agency responsible for internal reductions and creates demand signals for green goods and services. One of the examples we can think of is Singapore. The Singapore coming up with the initiative that's called Green Government, whereby they launched the cross-government sustainability movement with sectoral targets, for example, energy, water, waste consumption, and also launched green procurement commitments, require the reporting, for example, green mark for buildings, etc. So again, this is a clear shift from policy to measurable agency commitments. Another thing is we also see that the governments make the green and sustainable public procurement more mandatory, or they actually, if not mandatory, then they strongly encourage it. So we see more and more of the laws, guidelines, regulations, and product list launched by the government to require or prioritize purchasing of low carbon, energy efficient, or certified products, e-vehicles, green sustainable office supplies, green buildings, etc. Many countries actually even launch official list criteria or evaluation procedures to score tenders on environmental attributes. One example I want to share is South Korea. They have introduced the Green Procurement Law. They also introduced what we call is 2020 Green New Deal that use the government buying and investment to jumpstart green markets. And they also have a formal evaluation report to show the use of the green procurement. Right. For Japan, they also introduced the Act on Promoting Green Purchasing that requires the government entities to implement green purchasing. And they not just only require, but they also provide criteria and guidance, which again help the agencies to implement such procurement requirement more easily. On the separate point, we also see that the governments in the region also require the climate risk assessment to be taken into account in public planning and infrastructure decisions. So they introduce, for example, climate risk screening for major projects. They introduce the national adaptation strategies. They also integrate the climate proofing solutions into infrastructure planning. Again, another example is China, where they introduce national climate change adaptation strategy, whereby they strengthen monitoring, early warning, and more explicit requirements around green project and green standards in the state program. So all of these are just introduced recently. The last but not least is we see that the government also increasingly use standards, labels, and binding codes to actually emphasize the sustainability in the procurement. They have a public building green rating schemes and product eco labels, for example. And now, again, an example here we wish to share is Korea published the evaluation and activity reports showing monitoring and lesson learned from the green procurement by the government. So again, as you see, all of what I just shared, the examples, etc., you see, like referring to Korea, Singapore, Japan, etc., mean that even though we see the Asian government have moved well beyond the theoretical commitments, many countries already have laws, procurement rules, agency targets, and monitoring system in place. But again, it's been very much focused around Singapore, Korea, Japan, China, more advanced countries. And the emerging market, we still see the implementation trend is still slow because of the challenges I just shared earlier. Thank you.
And so apart from China, we're really talking about developed countries. So what's happening with the Thailands, Indonesias, Philippines, Vietnams of this world? I mean, are they kind of at the planning stage, pre-implementation stage, or are they still just everything is on the drawing board and nothing much is happening?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Joseph. I think it's unfair to say that we do not see much of movement in those countries. Actually, we see a lot of movement and considerable significant steps introduced by the government in those countries. For example, Vietnam introduced the Vietnam Sustainability Index to actually rank the listed companies based on their sustainable commitments and activities. And we see similar initiatives in countries like Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia. But unfortunately, if we compare those countries, may I say, then of course we still see, and I think it is not just only for the Asia Pacific region, but it's the same for global picture, is the advanced countries are much more active. Yes. They have a more initiative launch. The implementation is a faster pace. But again, the good thing is we see the countries like Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand on the trend, rather than there is a huge gap between those countries. Yeah.
Right. No, that's exactly what I was asking, because I think the general perception sometimes is that nothing much is happening in Asia, because as opposed to Europe, which has got the European Union, and although in Asia we've got ASEAN, it's less united. So there's less, for lack of a better expression, advertising as to the progress that's happening in developing countries such as Vietnam, such as Thailand, such as Indonesia. And I think it's quite important to mention that there is movement. It's just not highlighted as much as places like the developed countries like Singapore and Japan and South Korea. If I can just move on to talking about a little bit on climate finance and mobilization, if I could. So despite growing commitments, climate finance flows remain a little bit uneven across Asia. What mechanisms, be it public or blended, are proving most effective in mobilizing capital for adaptation and mitigation projects? And again, Asia is a big place, 50% of the world population. So perhaps we can just focus on a selected few countries as an example.
I really echo you there. Yeah, the climate finance flows in Asia indeed rising, but unfortunately, they remain highly uneven. What does it mean? It means that we see climate finance is more concentrated in a few advanced or larger emerging economies, and disproportionately tend toward mitigation rather than adaptation in smaller emerging markets. Then we see that there are several public, private, and blended finance mechanism have proven more effective than others in mobilizing capital. So why don't we just go and talk first about the public finance mechanism? The public finance tools matter because they reduce early stage risk in private actors. The first very common one, Georgette, I'm sure that you are very familiar with, and everybody talk about it, is the sovereign green bonds and sustainability bonds. They are issued widely across ASEAN, China, Korea, India. They are particularly effective because they build yield curve benchmarks. They are also familiar with the domestic investors, and they also help to unlock subsequent corporate bond issuance. Countries like Indonesia and Singapore use the proceeds from the bonds for renewable energy, green transport, and adaptation. For example, the coastal protection. Again, why I mentioned about this first, Georgette, because these bonds provide transparent framework, have a very clear use of process, and the government backing element that help to remove the policy uncertainty, and that's why they are such effective. Another one, may I say, also have a long-term run is the government-backed guarantee and credit enhancement. So we see more the partial credit guarantees and political risk insurance. And they, again, remain one of the most effective tools, especially for projects like renewables, energy efficiency, and resilience projects. We should also not forget the role of the multilateral and bilateral development agencies here. For example, JICA from Japan, KEXIM from Korea, MIGA, ADB. They also run very strong guarantee programs in the region. So this guarantee actually help to directly lower the real and also the perceived risk premium that makes the private finance expensive, especially in emerging markets. Another one I wish to mention is around the national green banks or public financial institutions, such as India's National Green Transition Fund, Indonesia PTSMI, the Philippines Climate Resilient Local Government Unit Financing Facility. They extend long-term loans, take the subordinated positions, and of course, offer concessional windows for adaptation. They connect the local government needs with the capital markets, which is a major bottleneck in Asia. So yeah, that's why I would like to mention about this. Now that is the public finance tools we are talking about, and we can now move on further to the blended finance. So far, what we see, there are some programs that prove themselves to be very effective that attract more, may I say, appetite from the private sector. The first one is the concessional capital that I want to talk about. So the concessional capital is whereby we talk about the first loss equity and the soft loans. So climate investment funds, Green Climate Fund, ADB, and AIIB use these concessional tools to de-risk projects. Sometimes they combine with the commercial banks' debts as well. We see this concessional capital form particularly active in projects such as grid modernization, geothermal, solar and storage, climate smart agriculture, and water infrastructure. The first loss equity act whereby the government or those funds absorb the early loss really help because it helped to make it viable for the banks to take part. Another one I wish to mention is the aggregation platform for distributed renewables and energy efficiency. So this is whereby they provide a kind of like warehouse lending models And we see it quite active and pioneer in India and Malaysia. And such model actually had to abandon many small projects in terms of finance and small scale projects. Project I mentioned here is like rooftop solar, industrial park energy efficiency, or some EV fleets. So once this portfolio, because when they come in, they set this finance platform. And once the platform reach a certain scale and show stable cash flow, then the private sector will come in. It will have to actually reduce transaction cost, which again is the biggest barrier for small scale projects. And we can also consider about resilience bonds. We see it increasingly being used in Southeast Asia, like Philippines and Pacific Island, because those countries, they have a lot of typhoon, hurricane.
Yes.
And these bonds are usually issued with the support from ADB, World Bank, and some of the regional risk pools. So this provides very rapid liquidity post-disaster and ship risk off the government balance sheets. The last but not least is I wish to mention about the PPP models, the public-private partnership model with climate-linked risk sharing. And the private investor can gain more confidence in terms of long-term revenue streams because the government come in, they may provide land or viability gap funding or minimum revenue guarantee mechanism. So that is we are talking about the blended finance. I also want to touch a bit on the private sector mechanism that we see more a kind of drive the mobilization for the climate. The first one, similar to the government bond, here we talk about corporate green bond and transition bonds. Again, they are particularly strong in China, Japan, Korea, and Singapore. And the corporate actually filling the gap where public finance is insufficient, especially for decarbonizing supply chains in the projects like steel, cement, petrochemicals. We also see in ASEAN and India, whereby banks integrate more ESG performance targets into their loan pricing. So mean that they lower the interest if ESG targets are met. That's what are called sustainability linked loans. And the last but not least is the carbon market and result-based finance. And Joseph, I'm sure that you and I can have like 1, 2, or even 3 podcasts on the carbon market, right?
Yes,
anyway,
yes.
We should not ignore them because we can see like either like voluntary market or mandatory market. Those carbon market actually drive investment in product like energy efficient, industrial, or like greenhouse gas emission reduction. Some of the how to say result-based payment are working very well in forestry and mangrove restoration in Indonesia and Vietnam. Yeah, so those, and I'm sure that there are many more, but these are some of the, how to say, key fundamental climate finance tools we observe here in the region, Joseph.
Right. Actually, you already answered the next question, which was about the carbon market. So I'll go on to another question. You mentioned private sector engagement. From your own personal perspective, your own personal experiences, how mature is ESG integration among Asian corporates, particularly with the state-owned enterprises, which I know you work with quite a bit? What are the key barriers to scaling climate-aligned investment strategies for these kind of private sector Asian corporates and state-owned enterprises?
Thank you, Joseph. It's very interesting when you mention about state-owned companies. Because state-owned companies are very, may I say, dominant in the infrastructure sector in countries like China and Vietnam. Of course, they also present and also play significant role in some other markets, but China and Vietnam, may I say that the leading country with a significant state-owned enterprise presence. When we mention about them, we can see that the ESG integration among that corporates, especially SOE, state-owned company for short, has improved significantly. But overall maturity is in, may I say, generally mid-stage. And when I'm talking about that mid-stage, I want to mention about there is a clear gap between disclosure form and strategic execution or strategic substance. May I say that? Of course, we can see that market like Japan, Korea, Singapore, they are moving toward the new climate-aligned capital allocation. But while many others, including the state-owned companies, they still treat ESG largely as compliance, branding, risk avoidance, rather than something strategic, rather than something we can use as a kind of investment steering tool. Yeah.
Of course.
I think I can share it in more details here. As we talk about SOE, we can see that what has been improving is we see more state-owned company in China, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, that they receive the mandatory climate requirements because those countries, they actually also commit, Vietnam, for example, commit to become net zero by 2050. China has a very big campaign on energy transition. Indonesia very much, and Malaysia very much focus on circular economy. So the state-owned company, they are not outside that trend. Of course, they have to be in. And we can see that more and more of them adopt things like internal carbon accounting. They expand and acquire, invest in renewable energy investment. We also see that some of them green transition bonds, especially for the transportation infrastructure companies, whereby the greenhouse gas emission is very significant. So that is the improving. That is the very positive side we see here. But we see that there are still a lot of things that lacking. For example, we can see very clearly state-owned company, when they adapt those things, they are mostly like mainly driven by the national development goals because the government tell them to do so, rather than they take part as a kind of like the driving force, for all of those initiatives. And of course, we can see very clearly that profitability and climate targets, unfortunately, not aligned. And those SOE, especially if you look at China, they're under huge pressure of delivering the good financial result, right? So again, it is not something we can solve. We see significant improvement over the short time. Another thing we can see in the SOE is we see limited board independence, which shows a kind of weak governance oversight because we are talking about ESG here, right, Joseph? So, yeah, and they a lot of what they are doing still rely on concessional or public funds. So, Joseph, just to share with you, in KPMG, we have a sector that we call International Development Advisory Service, where we focus on working with the multilateral and bilateral agencies. And you know what? Actually, that sector we put under the government sector, which I'm leading for Asia Pacific. You know why? Because a lot of the cases, governments, especially and state-owned companies in the region, they still have to rely on the fund from those multilateral and bilateral to implement some of their climate focus initiatives, rather than have their own budget to spend on those things. Yeah. Yeah. So those are the reason why my view is, there is improvement, but the maturity of the SOE in the region is still at the at the very early mid stage.
Yeah, I think your point is extremely important, that they've got these kind of mixed targets and sometimes conflicting targets. On the one hand, they're state-owned enterprises who have to do stuff for the national good. At the same time, they've got profitability targets, and sometimes, and all of a sudden, on top of all the kind of parameters and rules, regulations, etc., policies that they have to follow, they also have to take care about climate risks, sustainability, environmental, social, and governmental goals as well. So it becomes quite complicated. And one thing that I really struggle with, and I think we and I talked about this before in Bangkok a while ago, which is how do you effectively educate these state-owned enterprises? Because putting all the managers in one room and telling them, hey, guess what? Climate risk is important. Sustainability is important. You have to take care of these factors. That's just not going to cut it, because they've got so many policies, so many targets to meet, that it becomes almost impossible. So I'm not sure what the best solution is. Obviously, training and education is absolutely key, but what kind of training and education can be most effective? I've got no idea right now, and I think it's quite complicated in Asia, where we've got so many different languages and cultures and way of doing business. And as you know better than I do, the way you do business in Vietnam is different from Japan, is different from China, is different from the Philippines. So it becomes very, very challenging. So on green infrastructure that you mentioned earlier, green infrastructure and also transition pathways. So infrastructure remains central to Asia's decarbonization. And what trends are emerging in green public-private partnerships, and how are governments balancing energy security with their individual climate ambitions?
Thank you, Georgia. It's a very interesting question. And of course, we cannot touch all of those within the time limit of this conversation.
No, that would be another 12 podcasts.
Which actually I really enjoyed so far. Thanks a lot for all of your very, not just only interesting question, but very diversified question. That hopefully will help our audience to have a different perspective. On the topic we are talking about. So just coming back to your question on the emerging trends in the PPP, and here we are talking more about the green PPP, is now just interestingly, based on the estimation by ADB, Joseph, Asia requires about $1.7 trillion per year. In infrastructure investment to meet all of the climate goals and overcome the challenges. And when we talk about infrastructure, we talk about sectors like power, transport, water, and waste, especially energy. Also, another one which is a very important. And of course, decarbonization will be a big target and an objective. So the trend we see definitely first is there is a huge surge in the renewable energy, and it is which the form whereby both the government and private sector come in and invest together. And this PPP form we can see in form of, for example, government guarantee, state-backed land preparation. So we talk about land clearance, etc. The government will just come in, clear the land, and then give it to the investor rather than the private investor have to deal with us. It can also come in the form of long-term power purchase agreement. And of course, here we talk about some of the BOT form, right? Whereby at the end of the project, the asset will be transferred to the government by the private investor. And in exchange, the government will provide certain guarantee that we mentioned earlier. So some of the
good old build and operate transfer model, yes.
Exactly. Yeah, the build and operate and transfer model. So some of those examples I just shared with you is in the solar parks PPP model, whereby the government provide the transmission, the land clearance via public agencies and then private developers coming in and invest in the solar sector. One of the park that is quite successful using that model is Batla Solar Park in India. Another one is in the Philippines, whereby they have a Philippines Renewable Energy Act and PPP center support, whereby the PPP are used for solar parks, small hydro, and floating solar on hydro power dams. For example, you may have heard of the Luneta Lake PPP solar floating project, which Meranco. Vietnam, where I'm based, Joseph, the government also think about under the wind PPP framework, still under draft now. They also look at combine the government-led marine spatial planning with the private investor project development, which actually reduce the early stage risks like permissions, license, seabed surveys, etc. Yeah. Another trend we can see is a growth in the electric mobility and transport decarbonization PPP. So we talk about government using PPP to accelerate e-buses, metro system, and EV charging. Singapore, for example, they have introduced the e-bus PPP under the Land Transport Authority. So the operators provide the fleets under the long-term operating contracts, and they also build the charging infrastructure for the e-vehicles in the platform that co-invested with the government. Similarly, the Delhi in India, they have a FAME second and PPP bus procurement, whereby Delhi and Bangalore introduced e-buses under the gross cost contract. So the private operator invests in buses and the city pays per kilometer fee. The last but not least trend I want to mention about is expansion of low carbon transport PPP like rail, metro, BRT. And those mega transport projects are structured via viability gap funding. Again, that which is very important, right? I see that it's really a leverage there to check if we are talking about the right scheme for the viability gap funding, the land value capture, and some of the private operation and maintenance contract with the private sector. So those are some of the PPP trend we see in the reason. Again, it is not like trend, but it's crossed over to what I just shared is we see also some rise in the carbon capture, hydrogen, and industrial decarbonization as well. Again, I will not go into the too detail, but yeah, just mention it as a kind of trend that my personal view is it will be a strong trend in the next 5 years.
The next area, and it's so far as you correctly pointed out, how it's been a very, very comprehensive conversation. But the one area which I think we really need to talk about is climate risk, and especially climate risk disclosure and kind of like the regulatory alignment for that. Are Asian jurisdictions, and again, I generalize, I mean, we've got over 50 jurisdictions in Asia, so I'm talking about some of the main ones, but are Asian jurisdictions converging around global standards like the International Sustainability Board or EU taxonomy equivalents? And that's part one of the question. The second question is if I could ask specifically what role is KPMG is playing in helping clients in general navigating these fragmented regulatory landscape.
This is my most favorite question, Joseph. I thought you ask about KPMG and how actually we can help our clients. But yeah, again, thanks for the question. So just the very short answer is yep. We definitely see that the Asian jurisdictions are more and more converging around the global standards. That is definitely a trend, but again, it has been developing slowly. and again, not equally, or may I say unevenly among the region. Of course, many countries we are talking about here. Anyway, to cut it for short is most of the ASEAN countries, we see that they are very much lagging with the ISSB. For example, they announced that they would have some adaptation or some strong alignment because the ISSB very much focus on the financial materiality, which is a very familiar criteria, may I say, to investors. The ISSB, I'm sure we all have heard that recently they have integrated with TCFD, which again, very helpful for the banks, for everyone, for every stakeholders in this regard. So for example, Singapore, the Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority and Singapore Stock Exchange require climate-related disclosure aligned with ISSB S1, S2, have to start in the large Singapore incorporated companies from this year, 2025. Again, don't forget, Georgette, that Singapore is one of the earliest official adopters globally of this. For Japan, they also follow this, but in their way, whereby the Sustainability Standard Board of Japan, that we usually call it for short as SSB Japan, they also creating the local Japan standards, but those standards are actually fully based on the ISSB, which are mandatory reporting for private market companies, and they will launch it next year, Joseph. Malaysia also the same, that they will face in such a kind of Malaysian sustainability reporting standards that nearly identical to ISSB, and they phase in from 2025. And Vietnam, they also announced that they will gradually adopt ISSB, but they now also already encourage the voluntarily ISSB aligned disclosure in banking and large corporations. Now, another one that we wish to mention is the adaptation of the EU taxonomy. So may I say that Asian countries generally, they do not copy the EU taxonomy outright. And instead they are adopting their own green taxonomies. But such taxonomies are inspired by EU and even China. So just some of the examples. ASEAN Taxonomy 2023 version 2, they covers power, transport, construction, agriculture. They use traffic light system similar to the EU, green, amber, red signal, but they incorporate coal phase out pathway that are relevant for emerging markets. Something that the EU taxonomy does not have. And Joseph, I think it's a smart move. You know why? Because come on, you look at ASEAN, Vietnam, again, where I'm based, Indonesia. I think majority of their power supply are still fossil fuel based. I say coal, right? So if they copy EU taxonomy, I'm sorry, it would not work. Similar for Singapore green taxonomy. They also model partly based on the EU taxonomy, but they adapt. For example, they allow gas infrastructure under strict emissions threshold. They support green finance for maritime and aviation because, again, they are the major Singapore sectors. They also include amber for transitional activities. Another example is the Japan Green Transformation Taxonomy. They support nuclear power, LNG, and hydrogen, ammonia, coal firing. So mean that they have some selective alignment rather than like full adaptation identical with the EU taxonomy. And to the second part of your question, what role KPMG play? And here we are not just talking about KPMG. Of course, we are also talking about Big Four. Then our key roles, I can wrap it for short, like we help government to meet the global standards with the local regulations. And a lot of cases, we come in and we help the government on a voluntary basis rather than we charge the government fee, because we trust that this is something really beneficial for the economy to make the pathway for the winner contest. We also have clients, and here, may I say, it's a bit of bread and butter for KPMG, and I think for the Big Four as well, is we have clients to build their ESG reporting system, build their internal controls. We also had to provide assurance for sustainability disclosure. We had to run the decarbonization and taxonomy alignment assessment. Of course, our training, not just only private sector, but institutional capacity training is something that we are doing very frequently. The last but not least is we have clients to perform the risk assessment for their supply chains, especially for the ESG.
Great. I think it's not so much advertising KPMG, because like you mentioned, the other three are doing it as well. And there's also a whole bunch of perhaps smaller consultancies doing such work as well. But it is absolutely important to try to understand exactly how our clients, meaning both governments and corporations, how are they navigating this very fragmented and evolutionary kind of landscape, as a regulatory landscape as well. So yeah, if I can just go on and move to the very last question, how it's a looking ahead question, basically, based on your experience and looking at the past 5 years, what are your expectations for Asia's role in shaping global climate finance architecture over the short term, meaning 3 to 5 years? Are there promising signs of regional collaboration that could accelerate progress? And the reason specifically I'm asking that is because, based on your own experience, we're talking about very often Asia is referred to as basically following somebody, like following what Europe is doing, as as a follower. So from that perspective, what are your expectations in terms of Asia's role?
Thank you. I really like this looking ahead question, George, because as we keep mentioning through our conversation so far, that we're talking about 70% of the world population here, right? And it means that climate finance, sustainable finance, ESG, green, all of these topics will actually see a big and significant movement in Asia. So having said that, I think that in the next 3 and 5 years, Asia will be positioned to become a rule shaper rather than just a rule taker or follower in some of the key areas of the global climate finance. And the reason, because again, Asia accounts for more than half of the global emissions. Asia hosts the largest pipeline of energy transition projects. It also has a fast-growing sustainable finance market. And here we are talking about Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan. And again, many Asian countries, like we mentioned earlier, that also using the national taxonomies that are actually aligned with international standards, and they have a transition finance frameworks. So whatever they are doing in Asia, I think that in the next 5 years, Joseph, I see that whatever adapt and come up, which in Asia will become a kind of global norm, rather than they just follow. And we should not forget about the carbon market. We should not forget about the Article 6 under the COP29, right? And last but not least, don't forget, please, that with the fast and rapid infrastructure development, Asian infrastructure finance will attract significant funds from all over the globe. Asia also is the home to AIIB, ADB, JICA, large export-import banks like China, Korea, Japan, sovereign wealth funds like Temasek, GIC, etc. So those are powerhouse, may I say, that can help Asia to set norms for the blended finance and for the climate finance. That's my view. And to the next part of your question is whether we see the sign of regional collaboration. Then I have to say that there are strong signs of deeper ASEAN Plus cooperation in the climate finance. The first one is the ASEAN taxonomy I mentioned earlier. So the ASEAN taxonomy version 2 is used by banks across Southeast Asia. It includes a transition category, especially for emerging markets. So who knows? I think that over the next 3 and 5 years, they can become the factor taxonomy for developing Asia, right? We also see some examples for the joint carbon market development. For example, the initiative by Japan, which is called Japan Joint Crediting Mechanism, with about 25 partner countries. And we see the strong activity in Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam. We see there are Article 6 MOU supported by Singapore, which countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Papua New Guinea, Bhutan. We see the Thailand, Switzerland Article 6 pilot, and they already deliver some credit there. Another size for the cooperation is the ASEAN Power Grid and the Regional Renewable Energy Trade.
Right.
So between Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, so they are piloting some cross-border renewable energy trade. Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, they are considering and talking about green hydrogen and ammonia corridors. So in conclusion, I'm very positive about the collaboration in Asia, especially in ASEAN, Joseph. And again, I am of the view that Asia will become, like I say, a rule setting rather than just a rule following.
That's great that you highlighted these areas of collaboration because, and I don't want our discussion to sound all positive and cheerful and rosy. There's an enormous amount of challenges, national challenges, cross-border challenges that we're seeing with the energy transition in the Asia-Pacific region. But I think that usually it's the negative stuff that makes the headlines, not the collaboration or cooperation that is going on and the gradual progressive improvements. A lot of people, especially in the West, say, oh yeah, but Asia is still building coal-fired power plants, therefore nothing is happening, they're going backwards, they don't care about climate, et cetera, et cetera. And I think during this discussion, we've established that there is quite an enormous amount going on. There's just also a lot of challenges. And I was looking at one statistic, for example, that something like 20% of, if I remember correctly, 20% of export income for Indonesia is from coal exports. So they can pull the plug and all of a sudden they've got 20% less income. So it's not something that they can do overnight. But that's really why we focus more on what are the developments rather than all the challenges, because the challenges are highlighted everywhere. Thank you so much for your time. I think it was really a fantastic conversation. I think we covered an enormous amount of ground in a very short period of time. Like you said, it should have been several podcasts, but I really, really appreciate your time and all of your insights. Thank you so much.
Georgia, I have to thank you because you helped me to have the platform where you and we can share to the world, right? More what is going on in Asia. And I agree with you that we cover a lot of grounds, but we cannot do it without your very insightful and sharp and comprehensive questions. So thank you again for having me. And I wish the Asia Climate Finance podcast continue to be successful and having more and more podcasts in the future. Again, thank you very much, Joseph.
No, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Asia Climate Finance podcast. Please be advised that this podcast is presented for educational purposes only. None of the information provided should be construed in any way as investment advice. Always consult with a licensed investment professional before making any investment decisions. Additionally, please note that the views and opinions expressed by our guests are personal and may not reflect the views and opinions of their current or previous employers.